right, so we have some questions here. Is it possible that all of this is evidence, perhaps not of our present day Homo sapien species, but other humanoid beings who came from other stars, millions star systems, millions of years ago? The same way Sitchin believed the Anunnaki came in 200,000 years ago.
Yes, that's possible. And if somebody reads my book, Forbidden Archaeology, they'll see that I just present the evidence. I don't really offer my own explanation for the evidence. And that was deliberate on my part. I wanted to save my explanation for another book because I wanted everyone who read the book to feel free to think about what their explanation would be. So over the years, I've seen a lot of people propose different explanations. One explanation is time travelers, people from uh, the, the present or future who journey back in time and do things. So that's one category of explanation. The other is the extraterrestrial explanation of the kind suggested by the person who asked the question. And there are even other alternatives that I've heard. I can't remember all of them, but I definitely want people free to be free, feel themselves free to think about how they would explain the evidence.
Yeah.
And that's so I'm happy that the author is considering that. If anybody wants to see my explanation, they can have a look at my book, Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory.
And with the skeletal remains that they find, are they able to know exactly what humanoid it is? I know you mentioned a couple of them, but are there times where they can't figure out what ancient humanoid it is, or it could be Homo sapien sapien, but they can't tell?
Uh, well, there are a couple of things that can happen. Sometimes something can be really unidentifiable, and usually they'll say, species unknown, like they can't assign it. But in most cases, they've gotten so deeply into measuring these bones and not just measuring them and writing down the measurements, but doing high level statistical analyses of fragments of bones so that they're able to attribute them to any animal or human population or population of hominins like extinct alleged ancestors of the modern human type. So the problem, however, comes as I tried to show in some of the cases I mentioned right at the beginning of the presentation, where they're looking at something and with their latest high powered statistical analysis, they conclude it is human, but we can't, but they write directly in their scientific reports. This is exactly like modern Homo sapiens, but we can't call it that because of the geological age of the formation in which it was found. So, that I think is the very interesting part where they identify something as human, but then explain it away.
Right. And it said, I believe it's conventionally accepted that Homo sapiens sapiens were have been here for 200, 300,000 years, right? And then
Yes, that's
ho-
correct.
hominoids around 6 million years. So if that's the case, or when we're talking about the 5.8 million year old um, smoking gun of the fact that humans could have been there too, we have evidence that there aren't as prehistoric as maybe the species would have been when we first came onto the scene. So that's where the anomaly lies, correct?
Yeah, if you've got a human-like print at 5.7 million years, they think that's before Australopithecus even. That they think who was around 6 million years ago in Africa, Ardipithecus, they call it. Uh, it's so yeah, to have something anatomically modern human at that time would be very damaging for their current consensus. I
Right.
will point out one interesting thing is that my book Forbidden Archaeology was first published in 1993. At that time, scientists thought anatomically modern humans were less than 100,000 years old. Then by the 2000s, 2002, 3, 4, 5, they were beginning to think maybe 200,000 years. And now, today, they think 300,000 years based on some discoveries that have been made in northern Africa and Morocco. So they've been going in the right direction. They've been taking small steps in the right direction. And it seems to be that every 10 years, they've been going back another 100,000. So we'll see what happens in coming decades if they keep heading, I think, in the right direction. But I think they've got a long, long way to go. But a journey of 1,000 steps starts with one or two or
Mhm.
three. So at least they're heading in the right direction.
Right, right. So it's not scripture, it's not written in stone that, 200, 300,000 years ago they keep finding evidence that it could go even more ancient. Because that was my next question. I was going to ask that if we did evolve into Homo sapiens around 300,000 years ago, that would probably lean more towards like if we had Homo sapiens millions of years ago. To me, that's more of like a time travel or extraterrestrial question. If we can track back the evolution of humanity to around 300,000 years ago, but what you're saying is they keep finding out that it's older than they originally thought. So it's just a matter of time. We just got to keep our minds open and just see what happens.
Yeah. And then there's considerations that go beyond the stones and bones that get you into the nature of consciousness and
Hmm.
what's the actual purpose of our consciousness and our human form of life. Those are kind of questions that I get into in other books like Human Devolution, for example. But that's where all this naturally leads. We're talking about stones and bones and how old they are. If it goes, if the stones and bones lead us to conclude that the current theories of human origins are in need of some drastic revision, we're going to have to think in what direction are those revisions going to go? And I think they're going to go in the direction of consciousness being something separate from matter,
Hmm.
and that the purpose of our human life is to use our consciousness to elevate ourselves beyond the limitations of the world of matter.
Hmm.
And that leads to some ideas like, well, what is the purpose of the universe then? If it has a purpose to give us the opportunity to educate and transform our consciousness, and that is best done in the human form of life, that would explain why humans have been around since the beginning, because we're not in an accidental universe. But that takes us far beyond the stones and bones and exact, but that's where it all leads eventually.
Right. Grace is asking, have you ever found any evidence of extraterrestrial interaction with the human race?
Um, yes, I don't necessarily talk about it in my book Forbidden Archaeology, but say you go to Java, which I did. I was invited once to come to Java and give talks about my books, Forbidden Archaeology and Human Devolution. So in in my days off and free time, different people in Java would take me, in Bali, actually, not Java, Bali in Indonesia. Sorry. So Bali. So they would take me to different places in Bali, like different temples. So there's one temple, Temple of the Moon. And in this temple, they have, like in a Balinese temple, you've got a kind of compound, and you've got several pyramid like structures made of wood mostly. And on the top of one of these pyramids, they had this huge drum. It's like about 10 feet long, and the head of the drum was, maybe 5 or 6 feet in diameter. And this huge brass drum is sitting on the top of one of these pyramid-like temple structures that were part of this Balinese temple complex. And according to the temple histories, that object is an extraterrestrial object. It came from the moon, which they believed was an inhabited place. So I kind of have an expanded conception of what extraterrestrials actually are. Uh, for some people, they're thinking flesh and blood creatures like us from some other planet, Earth-like planet in our galaxy. Uh, I think that's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. I think beings that in traditional cultures are called jinn and angels and things like that, more subtle beings from other dimensions of reality, are included in the extraterrestrial concept. So, according to their cosmology, in Bali, there are beings associated with the moon and the other celestial bodies. And one of these extraterrestrial beings brought this drum. And, so there are things like that. And then you can go to like the Ellora cave temples in northern India. It's like this huge mountain of granite or some other hard rock. And people have, ancient people have carved huge temples into the rock. Another place you find things like that is Petra in the country of Jordan. But at the Ellora cave temples in India, on some of the carvings of these rock cut temples, they've got huge galleries in them. You can rooms, you walk inside, all columns, all carved from the solid rock. It's pretty amazing. But some of the panels, sculpture panels, show Vimanas, spacecraft from other dimensions of reality hovering over human populations that are kind of pointing up and looking at them and things like that. So yeah, you do find archaeological evidence for contact with extraterrestrial beings.
You mentioned in your book, in reference to Vedic knowledge, do you think that beings like Rama were real? If so, was he a humanoid being from another dimension, star system? What are your thoughts?
Uh, I think they are real, from, the accounts come from Vedic historical texts like the Puranas and the Itihasas, among which one of them is called the Ramayana. It's all about Ram. Uh, Ram, in terms of theology, is known as an avatar or incarnation of Vishnu, who is the supreme god of the Vedic tradition, at least according to the school of thought that I follow. So Rama illustrated the life of a member of the royal order. He was in the solar dynasty, the Surya Vamsha, and he underwent many trials in which involved battles with forces representing the forces of darkness in the universe. So some people say that Star Wars, the Star Wars series of films were inspired by uh, George Lucas and his study of ancient wisdom traditions, which speak about celestial wars between the forces of darkness and light, like the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and other epics from ancient India. So yeah, I think it was a real personality. But there we have to perhaps expand our conception of what real is. If we take a strictly materialist view, these things may seem like fantasy or inventions. If we take a consciousness based view of the universe, then that opens up lots of new possibilities for appreciating what is real and how those realities are relevant to us in our lives today.
Growing up, Hindu myself, Indian Hindu, I had to go to Sunday classes, and I had to learn the Bhagavad Gita and learn hymns and all that. And as I was going to all these courses and classes, I was being told different things about the antiquity of India and the information there. I was told that Vedas were written 100,000 years ago. Then I was told 10,000 years ago, and then I did my own research, and conventionally said that maybe around 1,900 BC the Vedas were written. But I'm trying to connect some dots here, so I'm just giving you this information. Is there anything that you could tell me on what you believe is the evolution of current day India and the modern Hindu religion?
Uh, yes, uh, it's any big religion is actually quite diverse. And that's why I call my book Human Devolution not the Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory, but a Vedic alternative. So within Hinduism, the Vedic tradition generally, we find there's diversity. There's also some unity. So sometimes it's said there's a principle unity and diversity, but it's diverse. If you study the Vedas very carefully, it says even right from the beginning, there are darshan, 6 darshans, or ways of looking at the world, one of which is a basically atheistic, materialist, reductionist view. There are philosophers who study in that way and conclude in that way. Then there's other groups of philosophers who are more or less dedicated to a consciousness or spiritual based worldview. which is Advaita, undifferentiated, meaning everything is one. Then there are other philosophers, and I'm kind of put myself in this school, who say, yes, everything is consciousness based, but it's simultaneously one and different. So there can be, yes, we're all one in the sense that we're like each other. We're not so radically different that we can't understand or appreciate each other. Yet at the same time, we're all individuals. We're one and different simultaneously. So there are different schools of thought, and they may have different ideas about the age of the Vedas. But if we actually look at what the Vedas themselves say, they say they're apaurushaya, which means they aren't composed at some particular point in history. Said that the Vedas are the breath of God. That means they exist before the creation of the universe, which is governed by space and time and things like that. So the Vedas ultimately come, they're not ever created or composed. They're manifested in human society at particular times, but their own nature is from a timeless, eternal realm beyond the world of matter with all its changes.
Thank you.
That's how I deal with it.
Thank you for that. Next question here. How would you describe the seemingly constant cycles of evolution, devolution, evolution, devolution? Why can't we stay in a higher level of consciousness?
Uh, we can. It just depends where we direct our attention. If we direct our attention to things that are caught up in the cycle of time, then we see that everything has a beginning and an end. So it's if we're if if we put our attention on those temporary things, then we're going to find ourselves involved in that temporary flow of events where things pass away and come into being, pass away, come into being. So the basic idea of yoga and meditation is to focus the attention on the things that are timeless, that are beyond the destructive force of time. So that is, if one can focus one's attention on what is permanent, then one's whole being follows one's attention and awareness and becomes absorbed in that. So that is the real purpose of human civilization, which has been forgotten by the dominant forces in the world today.
Mhm. Are you aware of the concept of cycles within cycles? I've heard that, let's say the Kali Yuga, all the ages, Bronze Age, Silver Age, that that actually exists within the larger cycle that also has a golden age. So you can have a Kali Yuga within a golden age. You can have a Bronze Age within a golden age. Have you ever heard anything like this? Is there any truth to this?
Yeah, we're getting, and this is like what I said, we start out with stones and bones, and it leads to so many other things. So, yeah, uh, the school of thought that I follow says that, yes, there's a cycle of yugas, like Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Kali Yuga. Satya Yuga is an age of peace. Everyone is living very simply, very naturally. They're not divided up into different classes. Everybody is more or less equal. The opportunity for everyone to be involved in yoga and meditation is there. Everything is perfectly arranged for self-realization and consciousness elevation. And then the next stage, things get worse by, let's say, 25%. In other words, people start dividing themselves up into different groups and classes. Life becomes a little more difficult. You got to do some hard labor to get the necessities of life. You have to begin processes of ritualistic religious practices, but still things are basically on the right track. And then the next stage, things get worse by 25%. And you get large scale conflicts, things like that. But still, there are some forces of good, some forces of not so good. You know, just depends upon where you are. And then in the next stage, which is the age we're in now, it's the Kali Yuga, it's said that it's an age of increasing environmental and social disturbance, which we actually kind of can see happening all around us. But it's said, according to the teachings of the line of gurus that I've associated myself with, that for 10,000 years from now, about 500 years ago, and for the next 9,500 years, even though it's Kali Yuga, there will be a chance, like, to make the world like it was in Satya Yuga. And then after that 10,000 years, then Kali comes back into the age of Kali comes back into full force. It's kind of just like when winter's coming on in a temperate zone country. When winter's coming on, sometimes you get a few warm days. It's cold, and then you get a few warm days. Then after that, the heavy part of the winter comes. So we're in a situation like that right now, where although the general trend of the age is downward, it's now possible for individuals and groups of people to make make their world pretty much like Satya Yuga, the golden age.
When you look at the world through these cycles and these ages, it's very hard to judge people, right? Because you're seeing, like we're saying, like more of this energy comes to the earth, and so it shows that we're a product of these cycles as well as our own collective intention. But I feel it really proves even more that the reason we're here is to experience, right? Because why else would we be going through these ages unless it was a part of the plan originally? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I think we're I think those who were more intelligent, they've already gotten out of this cycle business.
Hmm.
They've transcended to a level where that's no longer necessary. Uh, so I think in each age, things there's opportunities for realization, which has to be given. One has to decide to do it freely. It's not something that's going to be forced on anyone, on any particular conscious entity. If someone is satisfied with life in the world of matter and they want to continue pursuing it, and don't really see the advantage of transcending it, then they'll have that opportunity. But they'll have to go through the seasonal differences of the different ages and in the cycle. So it depends on, you can say the powers that are on the higher level, not necessarily the powers that are in charge of today's economy and political system, but those who are in charge on a larger level, they give every conscious self the ability to freely choose where they're going to put their energy and attention. So up to each one of us.
Definitely, I resonate with that for sure. Okay, Susan is asking, do you have any information about archaeological findings in the deep digs of Antarctica ice?
I've heard about such things. They're very difficult to trace to the actual source, but the actual sources, to find the individuals or scientists that have actually made the reports. And it's a little bit complicated because there are certain websites that if you look carefully at them, they say, they present themselves as news organizations, but if you carefully read their about us, you see the reports, they'll say the reports on this site are fictional. Da, 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 if you read the fine print. So that complicates things a little bit. But just in general, uh, Antarctica millions of years ago was free from ice and it was temperate. It wasn't like freezing cold all the time like it is in most places in Antarctica today. There were forests, there were animals, plants, birds, and there are reports of discoveries of archaeological remains, in other words, remains of humans who may have existed either before the ice came or afterwards. They continued existing during the presence of the ice somehow or other. So there are reports like that, but they're very difficult to verify. Say, in terms of the discoveries for evidence for extreme human antiquity, you'll see I was able to go into, if you looked at the presentation slides, you'll see there are cases like the California gold mine discoveries, the artifacts of Carlos Ribeiro, where I was actually able to go into the museums, find the artifacts that are mentioned in the reports, study them, verify that they exist, and things like that. So it's very difficult to do that with the reports coming out of Antarctica. You know, just in principle, I don't have any objection to such things, but I would like myself, before I start propagating them, be able to verify at least some of them. It's not that everything has to be verified, but if I were able to do that, I'd be more comfortable about putting them out. So that's
Definitely. Okay, so we have two. I'm seeing how many questions we have left here. One, two, I think we have two questions left. Okay. Joseph Campbell had assumed the time cycles of hundreds of thousands of years found in Vedic texts were symbolic, as he did not have the understanding that it was a literal interpretation of time. How did those who wrote the Vedas acquire this knowledge of time and ancient history?
Um, the Vedas are purporting or claiming to be giving evidence that's beyond history. So, I mean, ultimately, that's what the claim is. So, how to verify that is a question. It depends on what one takes as evidence. So, the Vedic epistemology says there's basically three paths for knowledge. One is called pratyaksha in the ordinary sense of the word, meaning what's available to our senses. Of course, as human beings, we only live for about 100 years of our time, 100 solar years, which is not a long time. So we can't observe ourselves uh, very, a very big span of time. Like I was born in the mid 20th century. I'm now entering the last part of the life of this embodiment. And, then, so what's my experience or anybody's real experience? They can only hypothesize about the past or the future, you know, by making certain assumptions and things like that. And that making of assumptions is what's called anumana or hypothesis. If I see a tree and I assume that each ring in the tree represents a year, and I assume that somebody didn't recently make this tree, then by counting the tree rings, I can say something about how many years the tree lived. And a tree will live longer than I do, or any human will. So then, making that assumption, you can say, okay, there's a larger period of time available. Then you make further assumptions about the nature of radioactivity and its presence in different minerals and what the half-lives of these radioactive elements are and different things. And then you can make assumptions about larger uh, periods of time. But that's always going to change, based on who's making the assumptions and what conclusions they come to. That's why if you study the scientific ideas about history and time, how old the universe is, it's always changing. You look over the past several hundred years at the estimates for the age of the universe, ranging from 5,000 years to was they now say about 13.5 billion. 50 years from now, they'll have a different idea. So then the third source of knowledge, according to the Vedic epistemology, is called the Shabda Praman, means the testimony of a reliable witness. So this assumes, again, that there is a supreme conscious intelligent being who has set up the whole system and will know everything about the system that has been set up. The cosmic manifestation will know everything about it and is capable of communicating to humans on our level of reality whatever is advisable for them to understand and know about the cosmic manifestation. So it is from that source that we get the information about the time cycles. And so it's from a different source of knowledge than, say, Professor Campbell was applying. So,
Thank you. Okay, we have here another question from Grace. Have you researched the presence of giant skeletons found in many places on the Earth? And if so, what do you think their origins are?
uh, yes, I'm aware of that. And there we run into the same problem that we encounter with the evidence for archaeological discoveries beneath the ice caps in Antarctica, namely that although many credible reports are there of the presence of giants, it is very difficult to verify them. I mean, personally, on the basis of the Vedic histories, I accept the presence of giants, by which I mean large-sized human beings. And for me, that means 10 feet tall or taller, because there are lots of people in the world today who are 7 feet tall, almost 8 feet tall. They play on the basketball teams all over the world, for one thing. Uh, and there are even a few people 8 feet tall. I think there's one person living today from Mongolia, 9 feet tall, but there's nobody 10 feet tall or taller. So uh, there, so although you can find many reports of discoveries of large-sized human beings, if you try to track them down, if you try to track them down and verify their existence, it's very hard to do. There is one case that I find very credible. It's a discovery that was made at a place called Castelnau, Castelnaw in France. I think it was early in the 20th century or the late part, very latest part of the 19th century. There was a French archaeologist or anthropologist named Lapouge, Lapouge, and he found at this place called Castelnau in southern France some human bones, not a complete human skeleton, but he found the femur or thigh bone of a human being. And if an anthropologist has a, a complete femur or thigh bone, then by measuring the length and dimensions of the femur, they can tell how tall the human being was that had that a femur of that size. And the one that was found at Castelnau, the human femur found there, the person would have been, according to the reports that were published in scientific journals early in the 20th century, those reports say that a human being with a femur of that size would have been over 11 feet tall, which I would consider to be a giant. So that is one of the cases that it might be possible to actually track down those large-sized human bones that were found in France. You know, I would say that that is a good candidate case. Um, and as I said, photographs of the bones were published in scientific journals, things like that. So I think those bones must be around somewhere in some museum collection in France. So yes, I accept giants existed. The Vedic texts talk about these things, but I would just like to see somebody verify at least a couple of these discoveries, and that'll add credibility to the many other reports of such discoveries.
Beautiful. Michael, that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
being here. Thank you for your work and truly inspiring not only many people I know, but inspiring me for throughout the years. I'm just really honored to have had you on this platform, and I'm excited to see what you're going to come up with next.
Great. It was wonderful being here with you. I think we're all part of a big movement
Hmm.
that is looking for viable alternatives to some of the current ideas and aspects of our current worldwide civilization. So
Yes.
good to be with you. Thank you for providing such a nice platform for myself and other researchers, and for facilitating the involvement of so many others who are interested in these topics. It's can't do it alone.
Yeah. Yeah, we got to do this together. And it truly
Yeah.
is the greatest story ever told. It's the story of how where every other story came from, how we got here in the first place, you know?
Yeah, and I don't claim to have a monopoly on truth, but I'm just
No.
throwing in my 2 cents. And if anybody finds it of value, they can take it up and incorporate it into their thoughts. So thanks again, Neil. And thanks
Thank you, Michael.
everyone for listening to a few words about forbidden archaeology and other topics.
Thank you, Michael. Take care, brother. We'll be in touch soon.
Okay, bye bye.